Hi there, my name is Harriet and I'm going to be talking about some of my PhD research on the effects of topography on resilience of fire-prone eucalypt communities to climate change. So the evolution of eucalypt protective bark traits in response to climate and fire modified by topography is understudied. We aimed to investigate if this may alter the likelihood of mortality in some eucalypt species and hence make them more vulnerable to range shifts under climate change. To do this, we tested if differences in bark thickness relative to stem diameter, or RBT, bark density, and proportion of fire scars related to whether trees were positioned on ridges or in gullies. We chose to focus specifically on differences between these two topographic positions to try to identify the most contrasting ones. Topography is important as it can create its own microclimates, and microrefugia can be produced in features like gullies. Studies have found that fires are most severe on terrain exposed to a high level of solar radiation, such as on top of ridges, which receive more sunlight than gullies. Another reason for the disparity between ridges and gullies may be that fuel on exposed terrain normally contains less moisture. Studies have also found that bark insulates the cambium of the tree from a lethal temperature of 60 degrees Celsius, and that the heating time needed for cambium mortality to occur corresponds to bark thickness squared. Bark density has been found to increase fire protection, but elsewhere, denser bark types have been found to do the opposite, as they increase levels of heat conduction by having a smaller number of air spaces that help to reduce heat transfer. That said, bark thickness is positively correlated to tree size, and in dry sclerophyll forests, where the study was planned, trees in gullies are generally larger than those on ridges. Therefore, converting bark thickness into RBT made it easier to interpret and more ecologically meaningful, by allowing us to make more accurate comparisons between trees of varied sizes. Patterns in bark density could not be predicted with confidence, due to the conflicting research on how it may act to protect trees. Still, there was more evidence in the literature favouring the notion of low bark densities increasing protection against fire than of high bark densities. Fire scars can form at the base of trees and occur following more than one fire, causing cambial tissue to die. Severe fires can cause scarring to spread higher up, and fire scarring is positively correlated with fire frequency, and tree collapse from fire scarring tends to occur more regularly on ridges than in gullies. So using all this information, we hypothesized that bark would be relatively thicker and less dense on ridges than in gullies. There would be a higher proportion of fire scarring on ridges than in gullies, and that the species with relatively thinner bark on ridges would have a higher proportion of fire scarring. So the study took place in the Grose Valley in the Blue Mountains National Park west of Sydney, Australia. 7 ridge gully combinations were targeted, equating to 14 sites in total. As previously mentioned, the sites were all located in dry sclerophyll forest. All sites had experienced 4 to 5 fires between 1970 and 2020, a high fire frequency for this type of vegetation. They had all experienced a moderate to high fire severity in the 2019 to 20 bushfire season, aside from one site which had been affected by extreme fire. The extent of eucalypt forest that was burnt during the season was more than 7.5 times greater than what had been burnt per annum for the past 18 years, much unlike other land types, which had mostly experienced a lower extent of area burnt. Eucalyptus seabori, piperita, racemosa, deanii, and oreades were all sampled, being the dominant species found across the sites. E. seabori has subfibrous rough bark, E. piperita has subfibrous peppermint-like bark, both E. racemosa and deanii have smooth bark, and E. oreades has smooth bark with stocking. So at each field site, we aimed to randomly select 10 trees per dominant species to get measures of absolute bark thickness, or ABT, and bark density from. The actual number of trees sampled varied depending on what was present. Tree diameter measurements were taken from the largest live stem of each tree at 1.3 meters off the ground, or the diameter at breast height, dBH. A screwdriver was gently tapped into the stems until it reached sapwood, which has a characteristic feel and sound. And the distance between the stem surface and point where the screwdriver bit joined its handle was measured using a set of vernier calipers. This was used to find the ABT by doing the total length of the screwdriver bit minus the distance measured. An RBT could then be calculated as this value divided by the dBH times 100. An increment borer was used to extract bark cores from the same stems, and all cores were transferred into sealed tubes and placed into a chiller bag. Upon returning from the field, they were then transferred into a cool, dark room. Finally, a 10-meter radius plot was produced. All trees belonging to the same species identified earlier found within this plot were counted. The dBHs of their largest live stems were recorded along with the presence or absence of fire scarring. In the end, a total of 306 trees were included in records for ABT and bark density, and 180 trees were observed for fire scars from across all the sites combined. The water displacement method was used to obtain the fresh volume of each bark core using an electronic balance. The change in mass recorded on the balance was equivalent to its volume. And this was true because the density of water is approximately 1 gram per centimetre cubed. The cores were then placed into sealed envelopes in a paper bag and put into the oven at 105 degrees Celsius for 48 hours to remove their moisture content, before being weighed again to obtain each of their dry masses. This temperature was chosen as it is needed to be over 100 degrees Celsius to remove bound water from the bark, in addition to free water. For cores that were friable, the dimensional method calculation was used to obtain their fresh volumes instead. And bark density was subsequently calculated for each of the bark cores after this by doing the dry mass divided by the fresh volume. So the observed mean RBT for each ridge and gully site are shown in the figure on the left. Using Bayesian model predictions, we found that there was an 83% probability that bark would be relatively thicker on ridges than in gullies, and a 12% probability that it would be at least 1% relatively thicker, shown in the figure on the right. And this was because even though the mean bark thickness of trees in gullies was higher than that of the trees on the ridges, the mean stem diameter was proportionally higher still. Only E. piperita, racemosa, and seabori occurred both on ridges and in gullies. E. deanii is known to only occur in gullies anyway. The figure on the left shows the observed mean RBT of individual trees on ridges and in gullies, and the figure on the right shows the predicted mean differences in RBT for each species. And this was calculated by subtracting the predicted means of each species found on the ridges from those of each species found in gullies. As you can see, only E. piperita was predicted to have a higher RBT on ridges than in gullies. The observed mean bark density for each ridge and gully site are shown in the figure on the left. Bayesian model predictions indicated that all trees would have a denser bark on ridges than in gullies, and that there was a 62% probability of their bark being at least 0.1 grams per centimetre cubed denser, shown in the figure on the right. The figure on the left shows the observed mean bark density of individual trees on ridges and in gullies, and the figure on the right shows the predicted mean differences in bark density for each species. Here, both E. piperita and seabori were predicted to have a higher bark density on ridges than in gullies. The observed proportion of fire scars for each ridge and gully site are shown in the figure on the left. Bayesian model predictions demonstrated again that there was an 83% probability of there being a higher proportion of fire scarring on ridges, and that almost a third of trees were predicted to have at least 10% more fire scars here, shown in the figure on the right. The figure on the left shows the observed proportions of fire-scarred trees on ridges and in gullies, and the figure on the right shows the predicted differences in the proportion of fire scarring for each species. As you can see, all species were predicted to have a higher proportion of fire scars on ridges than in gullies. The results of this study support our hypotheses that trees would have a higher RBT and proportion of fire scars on ridges than in gullies. It also supports our hypothesis that species with a lower RBT on ridges than in gullies would have a higher proportion of fire scars here. This is consistent with previous studies demonstrating that higher fire severities are more likely to occur on ridges and that there is a positive correlation between bark thickness and resistance to fire. The higher proportion of trees with fire scarring on ridges than in gullies can be linked to the higher mortality rates which are typically observed here. On the other hand, the results do not support our hypothesis that the bark density of individuals would be lower on ridges. And this aligns with some earlier work suggesting that bark density increases resistance too, though it does not align with much of the work saying the opposite. There are considerable probabilities that RBT and bark density would be higher for individuals on ridges than in gullies, that being 83% and 100%. Having said this, the extent of these differences in terms of actual data values were only slight. Species with subfibrous peppermint-like bark, such as E. piperita, may use their higher RBT and higher bark density on ridges for protection against fire scarring and mortality. This might explain why E. piperita had the lowest proportion of fire scars on ridges. Perhaps the higher bark density of species with subfibrous, rough bark, like E. sieberi, offers some protection on ridges, but that this is not as effective as having a higher RBT here too. This might explain why E. sieberi had the second highest proportion of fire scars on ridges. Yet E. sieberi had the highest RBT and bark density overall, irrespective of topographic position, and species with hard bark like this do typically have a high bark density anyway. Lastly, species with smooth bark like E. racemosa may be most vulnerable to mortality, having both a lower RBT and lower bark density on ridges, along with the highest proportion of fire scars. Knowledge of the spatial distribution of eucalypt protective bark traits at different topographic positions will enable better prediction of eucalypt responses to climate-driven increases in fire severity. Understanding this is critical, with it expected to lead to more species becoming endangered or even extinct. The results suggest that management strategies should be tailored towards species found on ridges, as individuals here experienced a higher proportion of fire scarring than those in gullies. Management could be tailored towards species with smooth bark like E. racemosa, which are perhaps most in need of protection due to their lower RBT and lower bark density. A limitation was that it was hard to tell if differences were a result of species variation or bark type variation more broadly, as E. piperita, racemosa and sieberi all had different bark types. Assessing RBT and bark density is not only important for conservation purposes, but also for mapping the biogeography of bark fuel types. And the importance of live fuel moisture content in fire behaviour modelling has gained much recognition. Still, there has been a comparatively low amount of research on bark adaptations with respect to changing fire regimes. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the talk. I look forward to your questions.